Welcome back to the Book of Mormon, a masterclass. My name is John Hilton. A couple of months ago, I was at a college basketball game, and one of the things I noticed was that the fans went to great lengths to distract the opposing team's players when they were trying to make free throws. They would do all sorts of crazy gestures, and as I looked around on the internet, I saw people holding up pictures of cats, pretending to be delivering babies, putting up statues. There were all sorts of things that people did to distract the player who was trying to make a free throw. Perhaps that's why legendary basketball coach Bobby Knight said, mental toughness is to physical as 4 is to 1. Or as Mia Hamm, two-time Olympic gold medalist, said, the most important attribute a player must have is mental toughness. I bring this insight about mental toughness up because I believe that in our time today, we need mental toughness because there are lots of attacks on us, just as there were in the days of Amalickiah. If you remember in our previous class, Amalickiah had become king over all of the Lamanites. Now, initially, the Lamanites did not want to go and attack the Nephites. So what did Amalickiah do? In chapter 48, verse 1, we read, as soon as Amalickiah had obtained the kingdom, he began to inspire the hearts of the Lamanites against the people of Nephi. Yea, he did appoint men to speak unto the Lamanites from their towers against the Nephites. Can you see how Amalickiah is dabbling in propaganda? And thus he did inspire their hearts against the Nephites. He stirred the Lamanites up to anger, insomuch that he had gathered together a numerous host to go to battle against the Nephites. If Amalickiah lived in our time, I bet he would have a podcast, and it wouldn't be a good one. Maybe it would be called Why Nephites Are the Worst. Next to him, of course, would be Nehor's podcast, Perfecting Your Priestcraft. But there's righteous podcasts as well. We've got the best sermons of 124 BC by King Benjamin. And of course, Chief Captain Moroni would probably have his own podcast, Being Faithful to the Lord our God. The message that I see from these first verses of Alma chapter 48 is what we listen to matters. These Lamanites who didn't want to go fight the Nephites over time started listening to negative propaganda and eventually were persuaded to go and attack the Nephites. What are we listening to? Now, the fact that you're listening to this podcast or participating in this masterclass video suggests that you're probably the type of person that likes to listen to good materials. And you'd be happy to know that while Amalickiah was obtaining power by fraud and deceit, Moroni, on the other hand, had been preparing the minds of the people to be faithful unto the Lord their God. I love that Moroni had a focus on preparing the minds of the people. You clearly have that focus by your preparation in this masterclass. But note what Elder John A. Widsoe said. It is a paradox that people will gladly devote time every day for many years to learn a science or an art, yet will expect to win a knowledge of the gospel, which comprehends all sciences and arts, through perfunctory glances at books or occasional listening to sermons. The gospel should be studied more intensively than any school or college subject. And I want to highlight that not only was Chief Captain Moroni preparing the minds of the people, he was preparing their minds to be faithful unto the Lord their God. As we go through these war chapters, especially today, I hope that you'll be alert for little strategies, things that Chief Captain Moroni is doing that we can take and apply in our own lives. One of the lessons that I see is I need to be very conscientious about what I'm listening to. Am I preparing my mind to be faithful to God? Let's take a look at another insight we can gain from Moroni. In Alma 48, verse 9, we read, in their weakest fortifications, he did place the greater number of men. This is actually a pattern we see in Moroni's strategies. In verse 14, we read, the city of Noah, which had hitherto been a weak place, had now, by the means of Moroni, become strong. Take a moment and think to yourself, when was the last time you or I took an inventory of our lives, whether temporally or spiritually, and thought, What are my weak areas and how could I strengthen them? As I was rereading these chapters in preparation for this class, I realized that one of my major weak areas is distraction. I've got lots of big plans, lots of hopes to have an intense gospel study every morning, to have meaningful time for communion with God. But it is so easy for me to get distracted, to lose my focus. And I realize that in my life, I need to put more safeguards, more things in place to help me to stay focused on what I already know matters most. How about for you? Take a moment and ponder this question. What is one weakness I have, and what's something I could do to fortify myself in this area? Let's keep looking at additional lessons we learned from Moroni. In chapter 50, verse 1, we read, Moroni did not stop making preparations for war. Can you see how that is in our lives? We're doing good things. It's a battle sometimes, and we just keep going. Moroni didn't stop, and we shouldn't stop either. Another principle is found in Alma chapter 49, verse 8. When the Lamanites came to attack Ammonihah again, they found that the Nephites were prepared for the Lamanites in a manner which never had been known among the children of Lehi. That phrase, prepared in a manner which had never been known, is so significant. And we could think about this in lots of different ways. For example, in our scripture study, in our worship in the house of the Lord, are we preparing for those experiences in a way that we never have before, really stepping up our approach spiritually to sacred opportunities to commune with God? I don't know if President Nelson had this verse in mind when he said, "It is now time that we each implement extraordinary measures, perhaps measures we have never taken before, to strengthen our personal spiritual foundations. Unprecedented times call for unprecedented measures." Take a moment and think to yourself, what unprecedented measures should you take to strengthen your spiritual foundation? Another lesson we can learn from Chief Captain Moroni is one that applies in lots of professional fields today. For example, I have a friend who is an oral surgeon, and he told me that as he prepares for surgery, he will wear 2 pairs of rubber gloves. I thought that seemed a little bit excessive, but he said, no, you can have an incident and one glove can get punctured. Having a second glove keeps things safer. And he went on to detail additional layers of defense that he employs while in surgery. Or think about the realm of cybersecurity. Yes, it's good to have antivirus software on your computer, but probably if you really want to be protected, you need multiple layers of defense. We definitely see that in Chief Captain Moroni. We read, Moroni caused his armies that they should commence in digging up heaps of earth. And upon the tops of these ridges of earth, he caused that there should be timbers. And he caused that upon those works of timbers, there should be a frame of pickets. And he caused towers to be erected that overlooked those works of pickets. And he caused places of security to be built upon those towers. Can you see all of these different layers of defense? Think about how that might apply to a person's life today. If a person is struggling with inappropriate media, yes, maybe it's good to install some internet filters, but that's just one layer of defense. How could I establish multiple layers of defense to keep myself protected? Let's look at one more strategy. In Alma chapter 50, we learned that Moroni caused that his army should go forth and drive all the Lamanites who were in the east wilderness into their own lands. And he caused that the inhabitants who were in the land of Zarahemla and in the land round about, that they should go forth into the east wilderness and possess the land. In other words, there were some enemies of the Nephites who were close to Nephite territory. Not only did Moroni move them out of that territory, he moved in Nephites, people who were friendly to Chief Captain Moroni's cause, into that territory. If we kind of liken this to our own lives, we might see that, yes, it's good to get rid of negative influences in my life, but I also need to then fill that empty space with positive influences. So over the past few minutes, we've seen several of Moroni's war strategies that we can apply in our own lives. preparing our minds for faithfulness, fortifying the weak areas, not stopping in preparation, doing things we've never done before, multiple layers of defense, eliminate any space for the enemy. Remember the importance of abiding by the precepts. How could you and I take these principles and apply them in our lives? Well, let's turn to what might be some of the most famous verses from the war chapters. It's where Mormon tells us about Chief Captain Moroni. As I read this description, think about Moroni's characteristics and how you could apply them in your life. We read, Moroni was a strong and a mighty man. He was a man of a perfect understanding, yea, a man that did not delight in bloodshed, a man whose soul did joy in the liberty and freedom of his country, yea, a man whose heart did swell with thanksgiving to God. He did labor exceedingly for the welfare and safety of his people. Yea, he was a man who was firm in the faith of Christ. If all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. Yea, the devil would never have power over the hearts of the children of men. Moroni is one of my heroes. We could probably spend an entire video thinking about these attributes of Moroni and how we could develop them. Now, with all softness and in all kindness of heart, I want to point out that Chief Captain Moroni wasn't perfect. Mormon records multiple times when Moroni gets angry. Once in the middle of a negotiation with Ammoron, who's a Lamanite leader, Moroni calls Ammoron a child of hell, which, as Grant Hardy points out, is generally not an effective negotiating tactic. Now, my purpose isn't to put Moroni down. To me, it's hopeful to realize that even someone as great as Moroni still had some flaws, still had some things he was working on. So if you or I find a few flaws in ourselves, don't get discouraged. We can keep growing and keep developing. As Mormon continues, he points out that Helaman and his brethren were no less serviceable unto the people than was Moroni, for they did preach the word of God. I love this reminder that there are many ways that we can contribute in building up God's kingdom. Some of these, like Chief Captain Moroni's, are front and center. Others are maybe a little less noticeable. But as President Howard W. Hunter said, if you feel that much of what you do this year or in the years to come does not make you very famous, take heart. Most of the best people who ever lived weren't very famous either. Serve and grow faithfully and quietly. So to summarize Alma 48 through the first half of Alma 50, we see Moroni's efforts to fortify his people, and these pay off as the Lamanites are repulsed by the Nephites. At this point, Mormon pauses in the narrative to point out some lessons that he doesn't want us to miss. He says, and thus we see how merciful and just are all the dealings of the Lord, to the fulfilling of all his words unto the children of men. Yea, we can behold that his words are verified even at this time, which he spake unto Lehi, saying, inasmuch as thy children shall keep my commandments, they shall prosper in the land. We see that these promises have been verified to the people of Nephi. Behold, there never was a happier time among the people of Nephi since the days of Nephi than in the days of Moroni. I might have called this an incredibly difficult time, but Mormon points out that even amidst the great challenges, as we keep God's commandments, we can still find great happiness. In the middle of this happiness, though, we find an unhappy story. A group of people in the land of Moroni began to take land from the people of Lehi in an adjacent city. Moroni resorted to violence, and the people of Lehi fled to Moroni for help. Moroni realized that he was in the wrong, and so he made a plan to flee to the land northward. And this would have had negative consequences for the people of the Nephites. But behold, we read, Moroni, being a man of much passion, therefore he was angry with one of his maidservants, and he fell upon her and beat her much. And it came to pass, she fled and came over to the camp of Moroni, and told Moroni all things concerning the matter, and also concerning their intentions to flee into the land northward. Therefore, Moroni sent an army with their camp to head the people of Morianton. This is a very discouraging story. It's a story of abuse. I admire the maidservant of Morianton. I wish that we knew her name. Take a moment and think about a principle that we could learn from her. One that I find is it takes great courage to get help when you need it. But that's exactly what this woman did. She fled and told Moroni all things concerning the matter. This is a sensitive subject, but when it comes to abuse, there may be times when we need to get out or we need to help somebody get out. I love what Elder Jeffrey R. Holland taught. He said, in a dating and courtship relationship, I would not have you spend 5 minutes with someone who belittles you, one who is constantly critical of you, one who is cruel at your expense and may even call it humor. Life is tough enough without the person who is supposed to love you, leading the assault on your self-esteem, your sense of dignity, your confidence, and your joy. In this person's care, you deserve to feel physically safe and emotionally secure. Members of the First Presidency have taught that any form of physical or mental abuse to any woman is not worthy of any priesthood holder, and that no man who holds the priesthood of God should abuse his wife in any way, or demean or injure or take undue advantage of any woman. And that includes friends, dates, sweethearts, and fiancés, to say nothing of wives. I hope that none of us find ourselves in this kind of difficult situation. But if you think about it, if everyone in this masterclass knows 10 people, that's 250,000 people that collectively we know. Certainly some of them are struggling, maybe even in danger. I think helping people know the story of Morianton's maid can give people courage to get help when they need it, just like she did. So Moroni sends Teancum, who stops Morianton in his flight. We're going to see that Teancum and his warriors, they're like the special ops teams. They're so powerful. Morianton is defeated and things continue forward. But there are still problems amongst the Nephites. In chapter 51, verse 2, we read that there were a part of the people who desired that a few particular points of the law should be altered. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal, right? Hey, we're just going to change a few particular points of the law. It reminds me of the chain word game. I don't know if you've ever played this game. It involves taking a word and turning it into another word simply by changing one letter at a time. Let me give you an example. So if you take the word rain, take the letter N and change it to an L, now you've got rail. Take the letter R, change it to an H, now you've got hail. We've gone from rain to hail just with some small changes. You can try this with all sorts of words, boy to man, joy to woe. You can have some fun with these chain words. The only rules are you just change one letter at a time, and at each step, the resulting letter combination has to be an actual word. What these chain words show us is that small little details can make a big difference. And that's the case with these few particular points of the law. As we keep reading, we see that these individuals wanted the law to be altered in a manner to overthrow the free government and establish a king over the people. Be careful about those who argue about just making a few small changes. Where will it lead? In the rest of Alma 51, we learn that Amalickiah leads a large army of Lamanites to attack the Nephites, and a group of Nephites, known as kingmen, refuse to fight because they want a king instead of the system of judges that has been set up. We'll talk more about the kingmen in a future class, but to be brief, Moroni is able to put down this internal rebellion, and then he turns his sights to the attacking Lamanite army. But the problem is Moroni had been so occupied with handling the internal dissension that the Lamanites had been able to take over several parts of the Nephite territory. We learn that Amalickiah is taking his army towards the land of Bountiful, but he's met by Teancum and his powerful men. So they battle all day, and at night, everyone's tired and they take a rest. Note that in Alma 51, verse 33, we read that the soldiers had much fatigue, which was caused by the labors and heat of the day. Now, that phrase, heat of the day, stood out to me because, as it's going to become clear, this battle is taking place on the last day of the year, on New Year's Eve. As scholar John Sorensen points out, if Joseph Smith had simply made up a golden Bible on the basis of his own experience in the locality where he lived, as some critics believe, then the 32 battles at the end and start of the year in the Book of Mormon would have fallen in western New York's windy, icy winter, a major error. The heat suffered by the Nephite and Lamanite soldiers on New Year's Eve would have been a hilarious blunder. Instead, the timing of wars we find in the scripture is part of a consistent pattern. It all agrees with what the Book of Mormon says about itself, that it is a translation from an authentic ancient American record. I definitely would not base my testimony of the Book of Mormon on the heat of the day that was there on New Year's Eve, but it's an interesting detail. Now, that night, as I mentioned, everyone was tired and wanted to go to sleep except Teancum. We read that Teancum and his servant stole privily into the tent of Amalickiah and put a javelin to his heart, and Teancum did cause the death of the king immediately, that he did not awake his servants. And Teancum returned again privily to his own camp. Now, I've been talking about how all of this took place on New Year's Eve. The reason why I know that is the very next verse. When the Lamanites awoke on the first morning of the first month, they found Amalickiah was dead in his own tent. They saw Teancum was ready to give them battle. When the Lamanites saw this, they were affrighted. I definitely hope that you and I don't go and attack anyone on our next New Year's Eve, but I do think this is a memorable New Year's Eve for us to remember and recount. I think Teancum is amazing, and so is his servant who went with him. We don't have any idea who this servant is. Now, I know what you're thinking to yourself, Brother Hilton, I wish that I could play a video game all about Teancum, his servant, and their adventures. Well, wish granted. Believe it or not, when my son Levi was 15 years old, he created a video game all about the war chapters in the Book of Mormon. I'm biased, but I think it's a super fun game. If you like the old style Final Fantasy type games, you will love this game. You can download it for free at johnhiltonii.com/the Book of Mormon. Just scroll down to the Alma 48 through 56 page on the masterclass, and I think you'll have a lot of fun playing this video game, or maybe your grandchildren will have a lot of fun playing this video game, but check it out. Over the next several chapters, the Nephites work to regain territory that the Lamanites had taken from them. Amalickiah's brother Ammoron now becomes king, and at one point, Ammoron and Chief Captain Moroni write letters back and forth about exchanging prisoners. There's a phrase from Ammoron that I want to highlight. He writes, "I am Ammoron and a descendant of Zoram, who your fathers pressed and brought out of Jerusalem." Let's stop and examine that claim for a moment. Would Zoram agree with it? It is definitely true that Nephi put a little bit of pressure on Zoram to come with his family into the wilderness. But later we read Lehi saying to Zoram, "I know that thou art a true friend unto my son Nephi forever." And in 2 Nephi chapter 5, Zoram and his family chose to go with Nephi. I think a lesson we can learn from Ammoron here is be careful what stories you tell yourself. In 2 Nephi 5, Zoram chose to go with Nephi. But now, generations later, Ammoron sort of has a twisted version of the story. The same thing can happen to us, and we'll explore this more in a future class. But for now, I just wanted us to be careful, to be thoughtful about the stories that we tell ourselves. Ammoron could have told himself a very different story about his ancestor Zoram that might have led to his uniting with the Nephites rather than fighting against them. At this point in the narrative, we learn that at the same time Moroni has been trying to win back territory, Helaman and the stripling warriors have been fighting in another part of the land. For me, their story is one of the most powerful parts of the war chapters. In Alma chapters 56 through 58, we see a long letter from Helaman where he writes to Moroni recounting what's happening amongst him and the stripling warriors. Helaman tells us, "When the people of Ammon, or the anti-Nephi Lehis, saw our afflictions and our tribulations for them, they were about to break the covenant which they had made and take up their weapons of war in our defense. But I would not suffer them that they should break this covenant which they had made, supposing that God would strengthen us, insomuch that we should not suffer more because of the fulfilling the oath which they had taken. Note that in this extremely difficult time, the ultra-faithful anti-Nephi Lehis were tempted to break their covenants. That's a reminder that no matter how good we are going to face temptation. Perhaps temptation to break God's laws, or perhaps just a temptation to quit trying. It's fortunate that in their moment of doubt, they turned to Helaman, the leader of the church. In our own lives, when we face doubt, when we're tempted to break our covenants, do we turn to the words of the prophets? Helaman knew that God would strengthen them, insomuch that they would not suffer more because of the fulfilling the oath which they had taken. That's powerful. Keeping our covenants in the long run will not lead to more suffering. It will lead to more blessings. Now, did you notice the words covenant and oath in that passage we just looked at? Dr. Michael Ricks, who used to be one of my students, has been doing some very interesting research where he's been looking at covenant-related words like covenant, oath, and promise, and seeing how frequently they appear throughout the Book of Mormon. As this chart shows, in the war chapters of Alma 43 through 63, these covenant-related words are more concentrated than in any other place in the Book of Mormon. In other words, instead of calling these the war chapters, perhaps we should call them the covenant chapters. It might be an interesting exercise to go back and reread Alma chapters 43 through 63 with the specific lens of what can these chapters teach me about honoring covenants. As we continue with Helaman's letter, he talks about how the anti-Nephi Lehis chose to keep their covenant of not fighting, but they had many sons who had never made a covenant not to go to war. These are the stripling warriors. Note that in Alma 56, verse 46, we read that they were all of them very young. What does that phrase, very young, mean to you? To me, it sounds like maybe 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, very young. My mental image of the stripling warriors used to be based on Arnold Freiberg's painting. But these kids are very young. Some of them probably hadn't even hit puberty. In some ways, the Arnold Freiberg painting takes away the miracle, because who wouldn't lose to those incredibly ripped stripling warriors? But when we picture the stripling warriors at the correct age and size, we can see the miracle in their victory and the courage that they had when they said, "We will go and fight." Helaman says they were all young men, and they were exceedingly valiant for courage and also for strength and activity. But behold, this was not all. They were men who were true at all times in whatsoever things they were entrusted. Yea, they were men of truth and soberness, for they had been taught to keep the commandments of God and to walk uprightly before him. As with Chief Captain Moroni, we can learn a lot from studying the attributes of the stripling warriors. Now, something that might be evident to you is that the parents of the stripling warriors are the anti-Nephi Lehis. That seems pretty clear from the text. Note a comparison between the attributes of the people of Ammon, the anti-Nephi Lehis, and the stripling warriors. Back in chapter 23, we read that the people of Ammon began to be a very industrious people. The stripling warriors were exceedingly valiant for strength and activity. The people of Ammon did never look upon death with any degree of terror. The stripling warriors, we read, did not fear death. Speaking about both groups, the exact same phrase is used. They were firm. We read that the people of Ammon were perfectly honest and upright in all things, and the stripling warriors did obey and observe to perform every word of command with exactness. The people of Ammon were firm in the faith of Christ, and Helaman, speaking of the stripling warriors, said, their faith is strong. Isn't that interesting how we can see the same attributes in the anti-Nephi Lehis and the stripling warriors? Now, I acknowledge that not every child is going to grow up and follow the example of their parents. In this case, though, we see the power of teaching by example. Elder David A. Bednar taught, as men and women, as husbands and wives, and as church leaders, one of our paramount responsibilities is to help young men and women learn about and prepare for righteous marriage through our personal example. Our children and the youth of the church will learn the most from what we do and what we are, even if they remember relatively little of what we say. Clearly, parents have an influence on their children. In addition, teachers, aunts, uncles, ministering brothers and sisters, and others can all have a significant influence. Just like the stripling warriors took on the attributes of their parents, one day we will be remembered less for what we did and more for who we are. I love the bravery of the stripling warriors. Helaman says they had never fought, yet they did not fear death, and they did think more upon the liberty of their fathers than they did upon their lives. Yea, they had been taught by their mothers that if they did not doubt, God would deliver them. And they rehearsed unto me the words of their mothers, saying, We do not doubt. Our mothers knew it. These verses have got to be the most frequently quoted verses at Mother's Day. And I want to take a little bit of time and do a deeper dive into these mothers of the stripling warriors. What do we know about them? In the June 2024 Liahona, there's an article called The Faithful Mothers of the Stripling Warriors by Julie Frederick. It's outstanding, and I've linked to it on the course website. I encourage you to go and read the entire article. Let me just share a few of the details that I've learned from Julie's careful study in this area. If we look at a calendar, we can see that the stripling warriors joined the Nephite army in about 65 BC. And let's assume that they're somewhere between the ages of 10 and 20. So that means that the stripling warriors were born sometime between 85 and 75 BC. Now let's assume that the mothers of the stripling warriors, when they gave birth, they were somewhere between the ages of 20 and 35. In some cases, they gave birth to a stripling warrior who was their first child, or in some cases, maybe their last child. With these assumptions, the mothers of the stripling warriors were born sometime between 120 and 95 BC. The anti-Nephi Lehis buried their weapons in 80 BC. So if we take all of this math together, that means the mothers of the stripling warriors were between the ages of 15 and 40 when this happened. So when the Lamanites are slaughtering those who had buried their weapons in the earth, some of the mothers of the stripling warriors were teenagers. They watched their fathers and brothers be killed. Some of the mothers of the stripling warriors had babies at this time. One was holding her 4-year-old and 2-year-old sons, praying for deliverance when she became a widow. These were real women. Think about their experiences. Do you remember how the people of Ammon fled to the borders of the Nephite territory and waited to see if the Nephites would let them in? The mothers of the stripling warriors were these refugees. Some of the stripling warriors were young children at this time. Others hadn't even been born. Some of their mothers were pregnant, nursing, caring for young children, all at a time of immense stress and difficulty. Take some time to think about the faith of these women. Think about their lives. And then think about the phrase, we do not doubt our mothers knew it. The mothers of the stripling warriors remind us of the importance of covenant-keeping women. They also remind us of the power of moms. I'm reminded of a great talk given by President Susan Tanner, the General Young Women President. She said, I know that for some time it has not been vogue for women to extol the virtues of motherhood, or for young women to express the desires of their hearts to be mothers. I particularly noticed this some time ago when I talked with a group of about 20 16-year-old young women whom I had never met before. I asked them what their goals were. The first few mentioned educational goals, such as getting a PhD. Some said they would like to go on a mission. All worthy goals. Finally, one girl timidly expressed the desire to be a mother. Then a few more girls talked about other goals. After one more girl mentioned motherhood, the rest of them joined in. But it was quite courageous for those first two girls to admit they wanted to be mothers. And this was in a very safe setting. Besides the fact that admitting this goal may set a girl up for ridicule, it may also set her up for feeling like a failure. She knows she doesn't have complete control over achieving this goal, which may make her feel vulnerable in stating it. It is also a goal that requires great unselfishness. It may require setting aside other more glamorous goals. I am sensitive to the many issues facing our young women, but I still affirm motherhood. As I was contemplating the importance of motherhood, my mind was drawn back to a book written by Jane Clayson Johnson called I Am a Mother. A few years ago, Jane made a video, and I want to share a portion of that video with you. Let's take a look.
There's some mornings that I'm picking up Cheerios off the floor or mopping up spilled milk, and I look up at the TV and I see one of my old friends off on some big story around the world, and I think, oh, what have I done? These are the last remnants of my former life.
Behind me, there are thousands of refugees spending their fourth night waiting in the darkness.
In the course of one day, I could be interviewing the president one minute, it's Martha Stewart the next. This is Dan Rather, and I anchored the one-year anniversary of 9/11. It was incredible. Once you leave network television, it's very hard to go back. There were many people who told me I was crazy, that I was making the worst decision of my life. I never compare my choices to somebody else's choices, because everybody makes decisions based on their own circumstance and their own desire. I always wanted to be a mother. I wanted to have a family, and that was my dream. My choice to leave my career and to be a mother for this season was something that I would do again in the same way. To have this now, after the experience in network news, working in television for those many years, there's something that I treasure about this now.
How are you guys doing?
When I hear young moms saying, oh, I'm just a mom, you know, or I used to do such and such, but now I'm just a mom, I say, no, you are not. You are a mother. It's not to say you shouldn't excel, it's not to say you shouldn't achieve, but what you do in your home and the work you do with your children is the most important work that you'll ever do. You're not just a mom, you're a mother. I am a mother. I would not trade these moments, these precious moments. It's a season of my life that will be gone with my kids in just a few years.
As we conclude our time together today, I want to pay tribute to my mother. She taught me how to read, and she taught me lessons from the Book of Mormon, and she taught me about Jesus Christ even before I was able to read. I am so blessed to, along with the stripling warriors, be able to say, I do not doubt that my mother had a testimony of Jesus Christ. I know that not every person who wants to be a mother has that opportunity. And I also know that not all of us had mothers who knew of Jesus Christ. But my prayer is that all of us can follow the example of the mothers of the stripling warriors, that we can be individuals who one day people will point to and say, I did not doubt that that person, you and me, knew Jesus Christ.